In order to continue developing our application, we're going to see how we can start to describe our users' views. Our travel agency offers its customers a list of tourist attractions that they can visit during their trip, and this list will contain the attractions that they can visit by country and by city. So now we are going to focus on the tourist attractions. We will be dealing with the name of the tourist attraction, the name of the country, the city to which it belongs, and also an image of the tourist attraction. At times, the tourist agency might also be interested in categorizing the attractions in order to know if they correspond to monuments, museums, or recreational areas. The question then becomes, how can we objectively describe these views? And the answer is by using GeneXus attributes and transaction objects. The attributes are the frame of reference upon which we will create the descriptions. The meaning of each attribute is given by its name, which means that for GeneXus, the name of the attributes is extremely important. The same attribute must always have the same name everywhere it appears. And at the same time, two different attributes will not be able to have the same name. These views that are expressed by the users are the ones that relate to data manipulation, for insertion, modification, and deletion, and they are the ones that GeneXus represents by the transaction object. Which attributes will appear in this transaction that correspond to tourist attractions? Well, we'll have the attraction ID, the identifier, the attraction name, its category, for example, if it's a monument or a recreational attraction or a museum. We'll also have an image and data about the country and the city to which the tourist attraction belongs. We'll see what the definition of this transaction is and what the definition of these attributes looks like within GeneXus itself. At the same time, we will be complementing this information with a few more concepts. Let's return to GeneXus, and we're going to define a transaction. In order to define a GeneXus object, we will start by moving into the folder in which we want the object to be placed. I right-click, and we choose the option New, Object. And we could first create a folder to contain the objects, and then we can create our transaction within it. For example, here, we're going to create a folder called Transactions. And inside this folder, we will now create our transaction. So I click New Object, and here we select the type of object we want to create. We will create a transaction. I'll give it the name Attraction, and I press the Create button. In the main window, we are seeing the transaction editor, and it is here where we will start to define the attributes, indicating the name of the attribute and their data types. Let's start by defining the attribute Attraction ID. I'm going to type the name in directly, Attraction ID. Its data type is numeric of size 4. And here we are seeing all the data types that GeneXus supports when we are defining an attribute. But here we're going to leave it as numeric 4. I press Enter, and now I'm going to move on to defining the second attribute. Now when I try to type it in, note that I can press the period key, and it'll automatically suggest the name which we assign to our transaction, which is Attraction. And this simplifies defining attributes quite a bit. So I define it as a character, and for the next attribute is attraction category, and that's a numeric 4. We'll go on to define the description And notice if I press quotation marks, it will automatically suggest attraction category. And I simply add description, which will be of type character. We'll then go to define country ID, which will be numeric 4, and country name, which will be a character. So now I define city ID, which will be numeric 4, and city name, which will be a character. So up to this point, we have defined the attributes which make up our transaction attraction. In order to integrate this transaction and the definition of these attributes into our knowledge base, we'll press the Save icon and save our transaction. Right after saving this transaction, we can visualize what its screen will look like by clicking the tab we have here. And viewing the web form, which is associated to each transaction. And this is the form which the end user will interact with in order to insert, modify, and delete tourist attractions. So as of now, we haven't mentioned the word table. We've only talked about transactions. If this were the only transaction that existed in our knowledge base, GeneXus would infer the design of a single table. How can we see the structure of this table? Well, if we look here within this panel, the KB Navigator, the Knowledge Base Navigator, we'll see the Tables folder. Within this folder, we're going to find our tables, and we're going to find the table called Attraction. That is the same name we gave to our transaction. If we double-click, we will be able to view it within the main window, and we can see its structure. It coincides exactly with that of our transaction. This will change as we keep defining new transactions, since GeneXus will start to find relationships between these transactions through the names of the attributes. So let's close the table structure and return to our transaction. Before we move on, let's mention the naming convention that we use in order to define the name of the attributes. It's called GIC and is a standard used and created by ArtTouch with the intent of assigning a name to the attributes in the clearest way possible. So we have yet to define the attribute which holds the first image, the attribute attraction image. So we'll hit enter and define it here. We press the period key, complete the name, we're adding image, and define it as a blob type. The blob type is the GeneXus data type which allows us to store images. In order to maintain the structure which we looked at the slide, we should place the attribute attraction image after the definition of the category description. So I drag it to that position and I save the changes. Now if we look at this tab that shows us the form, we'll see that it has automatically added the attribute which corresponds to that image.